There are a number of very important principles that underlie the functioning of public service media. We've already spoken about the distance from vested interests. So the idea that the ABC does not run advertising and that on SBS there is only a limited amount of advertising allowed, and that decision to screen advertising was certainly not without considerable controversy. So our first principle, that distance from vested interests, is something we've already discussed, but there are a number of other really important principles which underpin public service media. Universal availability. So the idea that public service media, the ABC, SBS, and all the subsequent channels, NITV, should be available to as many people as possible. They should be available physically and technically to as many people as possible. So people in metropolitan areas get the same content or the same level of availability of public service media as people in regional and remote Australia. So universal availability. Then there's also universal appeal, the universality of appeal in relation to the content. So the content that we see on public service media should appeal to as many people as possible. Now, that directly contradicts the next principle of public service media. So the provision of content for minorities, and that's a bit of a crude term, but historically that's how the principle has been defined, but we could talk about it now in relation to provision for culturally diverse audiences. Now, that idea of, for argument's sake, broadcasting in languages other than English on SBS naturally and inevitably runs counter to the idea of universal appeal. Because if you can't speak Mandarin, listening to a Mandarin radio broadcast or watching a TV show in Mandarin without subtitles is going to be pretty difficult. So a number of principles in relation to public service broadcasting actually contradict with one another. So it's about how we interpret them that is really important. So universal appeal, the idea of appealing the content of public service broadcasting, appealing to as many people as possible, doesn't necessarily mean appealing to as many people as possible at all times in the way commercial media might. Public service broadcasting also has a commitment to educating the public. Now, that might be informal education through the provision of interesting shows, so documentaries, news and current affairs, but there's also a formal education dimension here. So ABC has a very big educational media unit, and many of you are going to be really, really familiar with elements of that. If not only through Play School, but through ABC content that you might have engaged with at school. But also, both ABC and SBS provide English language education services for people who speak English as a second language. So if you're an international student and you want to brush up on conversational English, there are plenty of great services at QUT for doing that, but there are also services on SBS and ABC via their websites that allow you to do that as well. So there's both an informal and a formal commitment to public education built into public service broadcasting. As part of the principle of being distanced from commercial interests, we see public service broadcasting, the content of public service broadcasting, being largely designed to encourage innovation, to encourage experimentation, to encourage diverse content rather than mainstream content. Now, that's not to say you won't see some pretty standard forms of television across all the public service broadcasting platforms. You won't see, you'll certainly see, some pretty standard forms of radio across, the radio services. But you will also see experimental programming. You will also see programming that takes risks, if not in terms of its form, but also in terms of its content, on public service broadcasters. And you're much more likely to see that than you are on commercial television. So public service media provides a lot of freedom for content makers, and they are breeding grounds for emerging artists. So the number of people who got their start on the ABC or the SBS is a really significant contribution to the Australian media industry. And all of these principles culminate in the final ideal that public service media is designed to foster the public sphere. So the public sphere is this notion that the media helps us as a culture, as a public, engage in meaningful conversations, engage in conversations that move us as a society forward. Public service media is designed to help us do that, to give us the knowledge, to give us the information that allows us to become and continue to be engaged citizens who make a contribution to the worlds in which we live.